If you enjoy these stories or this content, please join us on the Freedom from the Struggle podcast, where we'll continue our discussions on demons and spiritual warfare. You can listen every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time on most podcast applications. You can also find us on YouTube and Rumble. We hope to see you soon. Chapter 1. So it begins. It was a warm evening in July of 1976. Southern Colorado has a very arid climate, so it was still an extremely hot and dry 90 degrees as the sun began to set on the city of Pueblo. This blue-collar town was built on the backs of the steelworkers who made their livings at the local mill. This was a tough and proud town with lots of culture. Many large families made up the city's population. On this day, one of those large families celebrated a birthday party at a local park. This was one of those days that a child will never forget. He received many gifts and envelopes full of cash. Back then, $5 and $10 bills were a lot of money. Tony thought he was rich. Still, the many gifts and cash paled in comparison to receiving his first bicycle. It was the 1970s, so the red and white masterpiece with an upholstered banana seat was the coolest bike ever. Tony did not know how to ride a bicycle yet, but he was willing to learn. He would now be the coolest kid on the block. As evening crept in, Tony's excitement began to wane. Tony was a scared little boy who was also very shy. He was a skinny, awkward child who did not fit in well. There seemed to be a deep fear that resided inside of him. Tony was a gifted child, to say the least. Although he was only 5 years old, most people who spoke to him would swear they were speaking to an adult. Therefore, he struggled to bond with kids his own age. Today was the best day of young Tony's life, yet that familiar anxiety began to surface. His anxiety was not normal. This young man was carrying a secret. Up to this point, the daytime hours were normal. Nighttime was altogether different. What he experienced when the lights went out was nothing short of horrific. Evenings were the transition between the normal days and terrifying nights. Each night, he hoped the terror would not return. Most nights, he was disappointed. Tony lived with his mother, Jade, and his stepfather, Stephen, although at this time in his life, he was unaware that Stephen was not his biological father. The reality was that Tony's mother had been date raped by her boyfriend's friend at a party. This was not information that a 5-year-old child should know, let alone comprehend. Regardless of his lack of understanding, Tony noticed the difference in how he was treated. Stephen was a drunk and a pothead. It wasn't that he was abusive. He was simply self-centered. He was the kind of guy that got paid on Friday and would not come home until Sunday night. Jade, on the other hand, cared about her children. She was a good person, but a victim of her circumstances. She had an alcoholic husband who magically made money disappear. She was forced to work hard to make ends meet. The stresses of her life took her away from the quality time her children needed. Because Tony was loved by his mother's family, life wasn't too bad overall. He had spent his early years living with his maternal grandparents, Francesca and Silviano. When his mother married his stepfather, they moved out to a small rental home. Recently, they moved out to a bigger house. His parents were excited to have more space. Tony was not so excited. Jade was getting the children ready for bed. She was the strong personality of the family, while Stephen took a back seat. That meant that she did everything and complained about it the whole time. Ray, Tony's baby sister, was still very young and therefore slept in a bassinet in her parents' room. This left Tony with his own bedroom. Most boys his age would love the idea of having their own room. Tony did not. He didn't mind the room so much in the daytime, although he preferred to play in the living room or outside. Nighttime was a different story. The last place he wanted to be after dark was his bedroom. As Jade was tucking him in, Tony asked, as he often did, "Can I sleep in your room?" She declined, giving him the same "be a big boy" speech. It is easy to blow off a kid when you have the belief that all kids are afraid of the dark. It's curious that parents rarely ask why. When a parent does ask, they usually ignore the answer. For some kids, the fear of the dark may be an illegitimate fear. For Tony, there was definitely something to worry about. There has always been a suspicion that children can see things that adults cannot. Parapsychologists suspect that sometime in the preteen years, this ability begins to disappear. As for Tony Corelli, since birth, he had been able to see things that other people could not see. Most people do not have a long-term memory that dips below 5 years old. Tony's first memories were from age 3. He had one extremely vivid memory from age 4 that he would never forget. In this memory, he was spending the night at the home of his grandmother and grandfather. He enjoyed spending the night there because he got to stay up way too late watching television. His grandmother had made him a bed on the sofa and left him to watch what he wanted. He remembered lying on the couch wide awake. He looked up at the picture window and saw a man standing outside in the snow, staring at him. The man had a sinister look on his face and didn't move. He just stared at the helpless little boy. After about 30 seconds of frozen terror, Tony screamed loud enough to wake the neighbors. His grandparents came running to check on his well-being. Of course, they saw no one. Further investigation showed no evidence of an intruder. The squeaky gate usually alerted the household of visitors. There had been no such squeak. There were no footprints in the 5 inches of snow that was blanketing the ground. Tony was sure that he had seen someone. This event was attributed to a bad dream or an overactive imagination. This was no bad dream. He knew that this was real. That night had stuck with this young man ever since. Still, it did not prepare him for what he would experience in his new bedroom, in his new house on Jackson Street. With horrible memories, Tony lay in his bed on his 5th birthday, waiting for his late night visitor. He had explained to his mother that there was something in his room. It was easy to see that her patience was wearing thin. She said, "Anthony, you're going to have to be a big boy and learn to sleep in the dark." He would often wait until she had tucked him in before turning his light back on. This was an effort to deter his unwanted guest. His mother or stepfather would see the light under his door. They would lecture him and turn off the light. Whatever it was lurking in the dark, it was patient. Where it went in the daytime, Tony did not know. Nighttime seemed to be its domain. It would wait until the house was quiet and sleeping, then it would emerge. Its goal was to study little Tony Corelli. Although bigger than the last house, this house was still relatively small. There was a small living room on the main level with a dining area, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms that shared a bathroom. Due to the limited space, This house had a unique attribute. The bedrooms were joined together by a shared walk in closet. Tony could enter the closet through his bedroom and exit through his parents' bedroom. The first time he saw his visitor, he assumed it was his stepfather coming into his bedroom through the closet. When he heard the noise, he rolled over to see that it was not Stephen at all. This realization resulted in a fear that froze him. What he saw was not something anyone should see, especially a 4-year-old child. What lurked in the dark was an even darker figure standing over him as he stared back at the shadowy form. Little Tony opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The adrenaline that surged through his tiny body seemed only to help him focus his eyes on the creature. What he was staring at was obviously not human. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw what appeared to be scales all over the body of a creature that stood over 8 feet tall. Although the being had scales, it also had matted patches of hair on random parts of its body. The piercing red eyes stared directly into his little soul. This entity exuded hate as it studied the small, vulnerable child. This encounter was way too much for a 4-year-old to process. Children's imaginations tend to create monsters that can be terrifying. This was scarier than anything a child could imagine. Tony closed his eyes, hoping that when he opened them, the beast would be gone. Sadly, this did not work. Like most kids who are afraid of the dark, he hid under his blanket. Tears began to stream down his tiny little face as the terror enveloped him. Frequent peeks outside of the blanket showed that the creature was not leaving anytime soon. Somehow, he was able to catch his breath enough to scream that high-pitched scream only a child can muster. The sound pierced the darkness and alerted his parents. He feared the monster may attack him before help could arrive. Soon, lights came on and his parents were in the doorway. His mother comforted him, explaining that it was a bad dream. Of course, he knew this was no dream. No matter how much he tried to plead his case, she would not listen. She stayed with him as he calmed down and eventually fell asleep. Then again, this was the first time. As the nights wore on, her patience wore thin. Now, on the night of his 5th birthday, he lay in the dark, trying to fall asleep before his visitor appeared. Sadly, he couldn't even enjoy this great day. Little by little, he saw lights extinguished and the household sounds diminished until there was silence. As the quiet increased, so did his anxiety. How could he sleep when his little heart was pounding in his chest? As many other nights before, he heard the closet doorknob begin to rattle. The door opened with a faint, slow squeak. The black form appeared. As the creature materialized, it looked like a large mass made of static, like a late-night television channel signed off for the night. Once it fully materialized, Tony could see it was the scaly and hairy reptilian monster that he had seen many times before. Little Tony had often thought of how to remedy this dire situation. He still had no options. This little Catholic child decided to pray. At 5, he only knew one prayer. He began, "Now I lay me down to sleep." Somewhere in the middle of his recitation, the being laughed at him. A deep, throaty voice said, "Your God cannot save you. I am God." Even at his young age, he knew this monster was not God. This was something else, something awful. Regardless of the mocking of his prayer, Tony had a revelation. This being could talk. This was new information. With every ounce of bravery he could muster, he asked the entity, "Who are you?" The creature seemed to enjoy the opportunity to converse. It said, "My name is not your concern, tiny human. I am a child of the Watchers. I am here to teach you things. I am here to teach you the truth about God." Tony sensed that this being was not sincere. He explained that he already had a teacher. The being continued, "I am assigned to you, human. You will never be alone. I will always be with you. One day, I may even live inside of you. You are mine." The words "you are mine" seemed to ring in his ears. Tony felt helpless, yet he screamed, "You will never live inside of me." The creature laughed at him and said, "I will either have you or I will destroy you." Terror pierced Tony's soul as he contemplated his next move. He felt so vulnerable against the sheer size of the monster. He did the only thing he could think to do. Little Tony closed his tear-filled eyes and instantly called on the one person who may be able to help him. One person he was told was all-powerful. He said, "Help me, Jesus." His cry was sincere. When he opened his eyes, the being was gone. The basement of the house on Jackson Street was partially finished. A bedroom had been built, but the rest of the basement was concrete. The goal was to eventually move Tony to the basement and give his baby sister Ray the room upstairs. Now, the basement bedroom was a toy room. His fear of the house prohibited him from being in the basement alone on most days. On this day, Jade was down in the basement doing laundry. Tony tagged along and was playing on the floor in the bedroom. He was feeling safe, and his playtime allowed him to relax and enjoy his toys. The basement was relatively dark, even with daylight peeking through the tiny windows. He felt the room get darker and instantly knew something was wrong. He could see into the section of the basement where the washer and dryer stood. His mother was gone. He had not noticed that she had left him alone to play. Fearfully, he decided to make a break for the door and fly up the stairs. As he took his first couple of steps towards the door, a black figure crept out of the shadows and quickly blocked the exit. Tony was trapped and had no options. Again, Tony's attempt to scream was hindered by the terror that coursed through his veins, as with previous episodes. He could not make out the features of this black figure, but he did notice that the creature was big enough to block the entire door. Now 7 years old, he had vowed to stop being a chicken, always afraid of something. Today, he was failing as the tears streamed down his cheeks. He could only muster a whisper as he pleaded, "Leave me alone." The being backed the young child deep inside the bedroom to the corner, showing no empathy. Tony closed his eyes and winced, not knowing what would come next. Then the monster began to speak. "Child, wherever you go, I will always be close by. Your God or your family cannot save you from me. I am always watching you. Your God has made you a special child. That is why I want to live inside of you. If you do not invite me in, I will hurt your family. I will hurt your baby sister. I will even hurt the baby that your mother is growing inside of her. Don't tell anyone about me because they won't believe you. They don't believe I exist. Even if they knew about me, they wouldn't save you because they don't love you. I am the only one who cares about you. I am your friend. If you don't let me in, we won't be able to have fun. If you don't let me in, I will make your life a living nightmare. You will never be happy." Even at 7, Tony knew this being was evil. He prayed inside of himself. He meditated on the same prayer he always prayed when the monster got too close. "Jesus, help me." The being backed out of the room and Tony screamed at the top of his lungs. Jade came running down the stairs, not knowing what she would find. Seeing that her son was not injured, she became angry and yelled, "This has got to stop, Anthony. I'm tired of this." The entity was right. She didn't believe him. He wondered if she really loved him. He also wondered if there was a truth to the fact that the creature would hurt his siblings. Although she did not believe him, he did catch her attention when he asked, "Are you going to have a baby?" An uneasy feeling crept over her because there was no way Tony could have known about the baby. She hadn't told anyone, not even her husband. This should have prompted her to ask more questions. Fear caused her to ignore the obvious. Unfortunately, Tony pressed. "That man told me you were going to have a baby." "Who told you that?" was her angry response. He said, "The man. Why won't you believe me?" His mother replied in frustration, "Stop making up stories, Anthony. There is no man." He knew there was a man. He also had confirmation that he would soon have another sibling. This revelation proved to this boy that this entity had the ability to see the future. It also knew intimate details of his family. As he sat on the couch trying to calm his nerves, he could not shake the feeling of impending doom. The hopelessness washed over this 7-year-old boy. He wondered why God would allow this horror. However, Jesus always seemed to save him when he was in imminent danger. Tony's thoughts seemed to be getting the best of him. He had questions about God. He had questions about the monster that was haunting him. As his mind raced, he felt a pull to return to the basement. Against his better judgment, he got off the couch and headed towards the stairs. When he got close to the doorway that led to the dungeon of this tainted house, his pace slowed to a crawl. He took each step with profound caution. As he approached the bottom of the staircase, he felt like he was being drawn to see something. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, his gaze struggled to focus on the shadowy corners. He was primarily focused on the unfinished portion of the basement. The concrete walls and floors made it feel like a tomb. He saw the pilot light glowing in the furnace. Then he saw the light grow to an intense flame 3 times in succession. Tony was frightened, but he knew there was something he was destined to see. It wasn't long before he saw it. His eyes picked up on the hint of movement just in front of the furnace. He saw a black figure emerging from a pit in the floor that did not exist in real life. He knew it did not exist because he had never noticed it before. He saw a being peek its head out of the space. As he stared into the darkness, the entity looked up abruptly, realizing that someone was watching. The being looked vulnerable for the first time. Perhaps the tiny human was growing in courage. Was God teaching the human that faith and trust in the Holy Spirit was how these creatures were defeated? Suddenly, the pit swallowed the being as it disappeared back into the floor, and both vanished. Tony ran up the stairs without looking back. Jade caught him at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing?" "Nothing, Mom," was his dishonest answer. She wondered why a boy who was afraid of the dark basement was down there by himself. She had an uneasy feeling as she contemplated the subject. If she was honest, she didn't like the basement either. She had seen shadows and felt the presence of someone she could not see. She asked herself, what kind of a mother yells at her son for being afraid when she is just as scared as he is? Fear often makes us lie to ourselves. It was March of 1979, and Tony had a new baby brother. David was a welcome addition to the family, but he came with a horrible side effect. The coming of a new baby meant that Tony's parents would want him to move to the basement. Ray was getting older and needed her own room. Any mention of a move to the basement brought a horrible tantrum. Even a spanking did not deter him. His parents were angry, but Tony did not care. He saw this as life or death. He had to save his own life. His sister had never seen the visitor in the room they shared, but she had often felt uncomfortable. Fortunately, Ray did not feel like having her room was an option. The thought of it terrified her. Tony and Ray were able to talk Stephen and Jade into allowing them to continue sharing the room. That evening, Stephen and Jade discussed the possibilities as to why the children were so afraid of the house. Each sat in deep contemplation. They had both experienced episodes of their own, but kept them a secret from the children. The subject was changed, and they went to sleep with their minds racing. Tony had often seen the creature, but it did not speak to him when Ray was in the room. It just watched him. He tried his best to ignore it. For a long time, this was the routine. As time ticked on, he learned to disregard the creature and fall asleep. It is amazing what people get used to. Unfortunately, this routine didn't last. One night, he was frightened awake by that sick feeling that he had grown accustomed to. He looked over to see the creature standing over his sister while she slept. The entity spoke to him, saying, "It is time for me to live inside of you, Anthony. I don't want to hurt your sister or your brother." The monster had never called him by his name before. It made him angry. He was also very protective of his sister. Tony shouted, "Leave us alone, I hate you." The being suddenly moved over to his side of the bed at an unimaginable speed. It said, "Don't challenge me, human, I will win. I am your god." Now at 8 years old, Tony had learned to pray by attending Catholic Mass. He prayed inside that God would protect him and his siblings. He looked up and the entity was gone. This gave him hope. He was onto something. He would work on being better at praying. He stayed awake for a while to make sure his sister was safe. That night, a warrior was born. One day, Tony and Ray were playing in their room. Somehow, a dare emerged. The challenge was to see who could sit in the closet the longest, in the dark. Neither child accepted the dare, so it was decided that both children would enter the closet together. They would close the door behind them and exit through their parents' bedroom. Doing it together would keep them safe, or so they thought. The two entered the closet and shut the door. They began to take calculated steps forward. After about 10 steps, Ray said, "Shouldn't we be there yet?" The closet was only 5 feet wide by 6 feet long. Her assessment was correct. They should be close to the door that would lead them out to their parents' bedroom. Tony encouraged her to just keep walking. Several more steps did not land them at their destination. They both began to panic. Although it was completely dark, they knew they were walking straight. They could feel the hanging clothes on either side of their little bodies. Ray suggested that they just keep walking. Several more steps, and they did not reach the door. They started crying as they contemplated their escape. Tony encouraged her to just keep moving forward. For what seemed like 3 or 4 minutes, they walked. They even turned back towards their bedroom door that they first entered. As the panic took full effect, they began to hear laughter. The laughter was sinister and mocking. Tony was terrified, but he felt the obligation to protect his sister. He began to scream, "Leave us alone." He knew they were not walking in circles. By this time, they should have at least bumped into a wall. This was the work of evil. and it was tormenting these children. Finally, they could not take it anymore. They began to scream for help. It wasn't long before Jade opened the door and yanked them both out by their little arms. She proceeded to lecture them sternly. The children tried to explain that they were trapped and that some man was laughing at them. Tony was blamed for the event and received a spanking for laughing at his sister. He took the punishment because he knew the story was unbelievable. He had tried so hard on many occasions to explain that there was something evil in the house. No one ever believed him. Why would anything be different this time? One day out of the blue, Tony was told that his parents had bought a new home. He would be moving. There are not words to express the relief he felt. This was the news he had been waiting for since he could remember. He truly believed that he would finally be free of the creature that haunted him. This was the happiest day of his short life. Soon the packing and sorting was in full force. One day, the family was out in the garage looking through boxes, sorting trash from treasure as they prepared to move. Tony was helping Stephen stack the boxes that were taped and ready to make the journey. As he worked, he became distracted. He looked up and realized he was alone. Stephen had stepped outside to take out the trash. The daylight came through the window, but Tony still felt the fear begin to well up inside of him. Something was definitely wrong. He began to make his way to the door when a figure that resembled a man stepped in front of him. His path to the exit was blocked. He had grown accustomed to spirit visitors, even though he didn't understand why they harassed him. He sometimes wondered why he could see them and no one else could. He knew the man blocking his path was not a flesh and blood person. The man didn't even have a face. He wasn't sure what the entity wanted, but he wasn't interested in finding out. He was looking for an escape route. Before he could make a break for it, the being spoke, saying, "It doesn't matter if you leave. We will always be with you. We will hurt you, torture you, and destroy your life. Your God cannot save you." Tony was frozen. He did not know what to do. He hated when he heard them speak to him. It made him feel dirty. He realized that he would carry this burden for a lifetime. A sadness swept over him in that moment. This sadness settled deep down inside of him. He heard a laugh that chilled him to the bone as the being disappeared before his eyes. This was a laugh he would hear many times throughout his lifetime. He knew that he must learn more about what was happening to him. He needed to understand. The day of the move arrived. There were boxes everywhere. The house was not ready to be inhabited. Arrangements were made for Tony to spend the night with his cousin Marco. Marco was a quiet teenager who was socially awkward. Tony did not see him as odd. As a matter of fact, he thought Marco was cool. He was about 6 years older than Tony. Marco was fully aware that his younger cousin enjoyed his company. The day included sports, television, and ice cream. It was a good day. When the family went to sleep, Tony and Marco stayed awake, talking about music. Before long, the conversation turned to a dare. Marco proposed they play a new secret game. This was the kind of game that no one else could ever know about. Something deep down inside of Tony knew this was not right. He listened fearfully as his cousin described the game, including the removal of clothing. Tony thought about running, but where would he go? Then he saw them, and he knew there was no escape. In the corner of the room, Tony saw several entities crowded together, staring holes into his soul. Terror overtook him to the point of incapacitation. Then the crowd of evil seemed to part, making way for one larger entity. This monster obviously wanted a front row seat. Tony saw a dark mass in his peripheral vision. He turned just in time to see another entity whispering in his cousin's ear. The creature smiled a distorted grin as it joined the other spectators. As the assault began, Tony tried to focus on anything but the act itself. The texture and pattern of the carpet proved an adequate distraction. As a matter of fact, the carpet would be embedded in his mind for a lifetime. God seemed to allow him to disassociate, causing him to have no memory of the actual violation. What was not shielded from his mind was the laughter of the creatures in the corner. Of all the voices, Tony could distinguish one laugh above all the others. There was a strange dichotomy present in the moment. On one hand, he felt that God was shielding him from the assault that was occurring. On the other hand, why was God allowing this in the first place? It was too much for a child to decipher. As he lay there with the side of his face against the coarse carpet, he could now see the entity he had known since he was age 4. What was only a few minutes seemed like hours. When it was over, the disassociation continued. The only memory he had was of the creatures who had gathered to witness the evil act. The new house came with a new lease on life for the family. They found a local church and began to attend Mass regularly. Tony attended catechism and began working on his first Holy Communion. Soon, he was progressing in his studies and became a regular confessor. When he achieved his first Holy Communion, the whole family celebrated. He was even selected to be an altar boy. One day, as they prepared for Mass, Tony summoned up the courage to ask the priest a question. Recklessly, he inquired, "Do some people see evil spirits?" The priest seemed occupied and oblivious to the fact that this is not a normal question from an 11-year-old. The priest answered the question with a question. "Do you mean demons?" Up to this point, Tony did not know what to call these things. What he had been seeing were demons. The priest gave a brief, superficial answer. The Mass commenced, but Tony's mind was on other things. This information opened Tony's world. An 11-year-old child does not inherently possess knowledge of the demonic. Now that he knew the name, he began to hear the word demon on television and movies. The word was probably there before, he had simply never noticed. Things began to make sense. Subsequent brief conversations with the priests at his church also helped him fill in the gaps. He now understood that Satan and his legion of demons are in constant battle with God through the lives of human beings. This was too much for a child to process. Tony had no choice. Ignorance kept him in danger. As the years passed by, Tony had many more encounters with spirits. He had heard different theologies regarding ghosts and demons. There were many conflicting views which confused him. One thing was for sure, he had the ability to see things that no one else could see. They were everywhere: grocery stores, restaurants, houses, and offices. They were working hard trying to destroy the lives of countless human beings. There were still lessons to learn.